You're listening to the Wrigleyville Nation podcast. Season ticket holders and lifelong fans with neighborhood ties discuss Cubs news and neighborhood happenings. Here's your hosts, Jeremy and Pat.
Hello and welcome to the Wrigleyville Nation podcast. This is episode 343 of the podcast. My name is Jeremy Deemer and I'll be your host. I'm joined as always by my co-host. He's my cousin. He's back at home, high atop Wrigleyville tonight. How's it going, Pat?
It's going great, Jeremy. Beautiful night in Wrigleyville.
It is finally. We've been podcasting for a few weeks now into the regular season, and every week we're complaining about how cold it is. This was the first weekend where it was like, oh, this is real spring. This isn't fake spring. Another punch in the gut. Winter comes at you. This is it. I think we've turned the corner. We're actually in spring now. I'm looking forward to some nice days out at the ballpark. And we've got a lot to cover. We had a nice week in Cubs baseball on the field. We will talk about the week that was. We'll talk about injuries. We'll preview the week ahead. And to help us break down all things Cubs, longtime friend of the show, you know him from his frequent appearances here on this podcast, as well as all the fine work he does at NBC Chicago. Please welcome back to the show, James Neveau. James, thanks for taking time out to talk Cubs with us tonight.
Yeah, doing so during a Cubs-Red Sox game on baseball to let people in behind the curtain a little bit, and Mike Tauchman just hit a home run. So clearly everything we thought we knew about how this series was going to end is getting upended as we speak.
We will see how this plays out as we record this podcast. We try to time it so that we're not podcasting during a game, but the way that this lines up with our real work schedules, we had to actually do a podcast.
We didn't tell the Cubs to play a Sunday night baseball game, in fairness, right? I mean,
exactly. So here, let's start with. Before we get to the Sunday night game, let's start with the week that was for the Cubs at home, sweeping the Houston Astros. We talked about it at the beginning of the show last week, where we said the Astros surprisingly not good. They are struggling coming into Wrigley. We caught them at the right time. And James, it was just good performances all around from the Cubs, tightening up some fielding, good pitching performances, and getting the hits they needed.
All the while just getting continually bombarded with injuries, which we are going to get to throughout this podcast. But I think that if the series against Houston kind of showed us anything, it's that this Cubs team, they're showing some resiliency. And I think they've done that throughout the early part of the season with and then again during this series, because you remember the way the Marlins series ended, where the Cubs probably coughed up at least one game they could have won against Miami, and there questions about the finish of games, etc. And even amid all of that, amid all the bullpen turmoil at the end of the bullpen, just keep finding ways to win ball games. And I think that it's kind of a hallmark of this team from last season, where they had a good clubhouse culture. I'd say that 3 times fast. And it seemed to me that they've really been able to kind of, withstand a lot of these challenges, and they're going to keep being faced with that Houston series specifically was this really good kind of indication of the way that they're viewing themselves right now. And they pounced every time Houston gave them an opening in that series, and they were rewarded with a really impressive, frankly, sweep of that series against Houston.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that we talked about on last week's podcast, one of our concerns at the time was the shortness of a lot of the starts Cubs pitchers were providing. And we talked about how the bullpen was really getting worn out with these 4-inning starts or less. And what we saw in the Houston series and early in the Red Sox series was some lengthening of starts, effective lengthening of starts. So we saw Wicks and Teon and Assad and then Imanaga in the first Red Sox game. Instead of going 4 innings, maybe 5 tops, they're going 5.2, 6, 6.1. And that makes a big difference, I think, especially when you're doing it effectively and you're only giving up 1 or 2 runs. And the bullpen responded really well. I think with the extra rest, you saw guys come out, even Keegan Thompson and Mark Leiter and others, pitching really well. Wisniewski pitched well out of the pen. And it was nice to see an all-around good effort. So the Cubs weren't in a position where they necessarily had to score a ton of runs in order to win those games, and oftentimes did it. But they were still able to get the wins because they had good pitching.
They did, and we'll talk about one of the big injuries right now. We'll start with the injury to Wicks. Wicks did pitch 6 innings, gave up 2 earned runs on 5 hits, 4 strikeouts, no walks. He is now on the IL with
You're keeping their starters in too long, darn it! Like
this is what happens. No, it's Jordan Wicks with left forearm tightness. Hayden Wesneski getting the start here on the Sunday night in his place. It's always cause for concern, James, when I hear that forearm tightness in the pitching arm. Very, very scary for a guy we were counting on Jordan Wicks to be the guy to make me to be okay with not signing Jordan Montgomery.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think in a vacuum, it wouldn't be that big of a deal, right? I think we've seen the Cubs have been able to kind of piece some things together this season, throwing a couple of different guys in the rotation, using occasion. They've been able to kind of cobble some things together. But when you couple that with the injury to Justin Steele, which has really kind of put them behind the 8 ball right away, because he was the guy that you really were counting on to get you deep into a lot of games that he would start. And then couple that with now the injuries to Kyle Hendricks, who I'm sure we're going to get to, and Drew Smyly, one of your primary guys who can kind of be that swing role, pitch more than 1 inning at a time. It's just one of those things where they could not withstand another injury. And thank God they got Jamison Tyon back when they did. Otherwise, this rotation would just be in, to, I guess, partial shambles. Is that a thing? Like 60% shambles? I don't even know. You guys probably would know more English words about this than I would, but it's just another one of those instances where the Cubs really cannot afford any more blows to their pitching depth, and yet they just keep absorbing and have 3 more pitchers, including a really important one in Jordan Wicks, sitting the injured list all in the same week.
It's getting kind of scary between Wicks's, what do they call left forearm? I'll tell you, so they call that pre-Tommy John syndrome, I think, usually.
Yep.
Sadly. If he is out for an extended period of time, that's a huge blow. Steele hopefully will be back in a couple weeks, like James said, hopefully in 2 weeks or so. But getting Tyon back and pitching effectively helps. I think the Cubs can't rely necessarily on Imanaga to have an ERA under 1 the entire season. So you imagine there'll be a little, I won't call it regression, but there'll be a little bit of evening out, when it comes to his numbers probably. But still, a good pitcher. Assad continues to amaze despite all evidence to the contrary that he shouldn't, but he does. And with Hendricks being, whatever, I don't know if he's hurt, but, gone for now. The Cubs are really in a tough position because, it's nice when Wesneski can get a good start for you, or Ben Brown can throw some good innings, but it gets back to that whole, can these guys go more than 4 innings at a time? And so far they have not been able to. Now, granted, they haven't really been stretched out and they've been kind of thrown in at the last minute in these roles, but you look at the minor league system and pretty quickly you see just a lack of more people to, and we talked about how they have so many starting potential pitchers at the beginning of the year, and then you subtract out a Smyly and a Hendricks and a Wicks, and it starts to whittle down. And Cade Horton obviously is the big hope, but shy of that, Julian Turan or somebody, I don't know. Like it's gonna be tough. And they're gonna. This is something they're gonna have to struggle with probably for most of the season at this point, I think.
I will say, to be fair, that you do, anytime you have 8 guys on the injured list, there's not a team in baseball be able to kind of shrug that off. I will say that there's been a lot of question about this team's approach to building the bullpen and the rotation. 8 injuries is still a lot, no matter how you slice it. So I think that caveat will need to be tossed in anytime we talk about it.
And it even leads to the axiom that I think we used in our podcast earlier around with Brett Taylor. You can never have enough pitching. Remember that old saying when we were talking about the Jordan Montgomery sort of miss or decision, I guess the conscious decision not to acquire him for 1 year. It was, I think, in large part because the organization didn't want to go over the luxury tax number, but also probably didn't view themselves as being contenders this year for anything more than maybe a division, and just didn't think it was worth the extra push. Of course, we argued that we think you should try to win every year, and it would have been a nice backup. Let's put it that way to have. But here we are. So no crying over spilt milk. But this is where we're at, and if the Cubs can keep wading through this and winning 2 out of 3 or 3 in a row, while a lot of these guys are hurt, that's fantastic. But this is the kind of thing that is going to catch up with you later in the year. So we'll see how this plays out.
Cody Bellinger on the offensive side also hitting the injured list with a rib injury. This one hurts the Cubs. But
us more than him, I think.
There it is. Yep. And so you see Pete Crow Armstrong getting the call up, and turns out last time we saw Pete Crow Armstrong, he couldn't hit the baseball very well. This time, he's doing pretty good. He's got a home run. He's got a couple of big hits. James, looks like his brief stint in Iowa here has helped him get off to a hot start now that he's joined the Cubs.
I mean, I do want to point out this is another one of the instances where in a vacuum, the Cody Bellinger injury maybe isn't necessarily like devastating. Like, yeah, it's a big chunk out of your lineup, but it's not like he was so far this season and you have other guys in the lineup that can maybe pick him up. But coupling that with the loss of Seiya Suzuki, and that's really 2 of your best clutch bats that are just gone, in a really what's going to be a key stretch of the season, because you're going to start getting into divisional play beginning this week against. I think that losing Bellinger at this particular point is just really painful, and I think that Pete Crow Armstrong, like, he's a guy that we all have really high hopes for, and I think rightfully so, has a lot of incredible tools, and I think that his approach at the plate has looked a lot better, and you could issues was seen with some other young guys who kind of come back up, and we wonder if maybe they're ready to take that step forward, and they maybe aren't necessarily there. But I think that Pete Crow Armstrong is showing some really good aplomb at the plate. I've really liked his approach. It's a very small sample size. I think only his 6th game since his call up, 5th or 6th. So not really, massive sample size, but, I've been impressed with that approach at the plate, and I think the way he's been conducting himself. And I still think that by the time this year comes to a conclusion, he may get sent back down when Bellinger and Suzuki both come back up. But I would imagine at the end of the season, he'll be getting some fairly regular roles with the Cubs, and he'll be kind of relied upon to do quite a few things for him. So it's really good to see him kind of come back and have the success that he has.
So a couple points, too, I'd like to make. At one point, I think, for a brief 48 hours or so, the Cubs are missing their entire starting outfield when Ian Happ was also hurt. But he did come back and wasn't out for – there was talk, he might go on the IL, too, and we avoided that. The Bellinger injury was so weird to me because it's not – and we've seen guys slam into the wall at Wrigley,
sure.
Just slam into the wall and knock themselves out and be back the next day. His injury, it almost looked like he – tweaked himself after he hit the wall. So I couldn't quite understand how that happened. It was very, if you watch the replay over and over again, which I don't recommend, but if you do, it's very odd. It seemed like he just had a very awkward bounce back off the wall, so much more than hitting the wall directly. As for Pete Crow Armstrong, he's hitting 385. Is he the next Tris Speaker, or is he Ty Cobb? We don't know yet. It's too soon to say. But certainly Hall of Fame caliber. I know Rod Carew is already planning on coming to some of his games so that he can give proper accolades. But I think the Cubs are going to be really challenged here, right? Because as much as Mike Tauchman is doing well so far, guys like that, there's a reason why they don't play every day, right? Because they kind of get exposed over time. So hopefully Pete Crow Armstrong can really, between his defense and just hitting it all, can come in and to get some meaningful time in center field, and the Cubs can kind of weather this storm. So we'll see.
I do want to point out, by the way, that Pat was making fun of us for talking about soccer earlier, and apparently he's sitting there in a dark, just rewinding and playing the Cody Bellinger injury over and over again.
Well, at least the injuries in baseball are real, right? In soccer, it's just LeBron stuff all over the place, right?
So let's so a successful series all around. You couldn't ask for much more against an Astros team there, and heading into the Boston series, Pat, you had to feel pretty good about our we had a unanimous 4-2 prediction for the week on last week's podcast. So we all felt good going into the Boston series. The Cubs could get at least one. We expected more, but it could get at least one, and with Shota Imanaga, the shooter, on the mound, dominating again, 6 1/3. He had 1 earned run, 5 hits, only 1 walk, 7 strikeouts, and that's the fun part, is watching a guy with that splitter miss bats like that and just get the strikeouts. It's something I actually look forward to. Imanaga starts more than anything else on this team right now. I don't know about you, James, but I get really excited when I know that there's a game with shooter on the mound.
It's been remarkable watching him pitch, honestly. Like, I think that we all kind of anticipated that there would be a bit of a learning curve and teams were going to kind of get the throwing the baseball and the way he was going to be approaching things. And I think that ultimately he's been, as impressive as we possibly could have imagined him being. And I think that you just look at the way he kind of conducts himself and the way he handles his business. And honestly, to me, the thing that really stands out is that guy has, like, the pressure of this game does not seem to be getting to him at all. And I know, again, we were talking about small sample size, B. Crow Armstrong. We're still at that point with Shota Imanaga, but I think that realistically, just looking at the way he handles himself, both when he's pitching and when he's not, I don't get the sense that he's nervous about anything. He's really enjoying himself. And, struggle will cause you to question that at times, but I just get the sense that he's a guy that's going to be able to keep a very even keel, and he's going to be able to kind of ride through the ups and the downs. And what more can you say about how dominant that guy has been? And Jeremy, I don't think it's any stretch to say that he has been by far the most enjoyable part of what's been so far a 17-10 Cubs season, and they're tied for first place in the division going in Boston. I think that that's a testament to Shota and just the way that he's kind of handled the pressures of coming over to the big leagues.
And I have to say that Friday game for the Cubs is one of my favorite types of games. You win 7-1. You out-hit the team 14-7. Your starting pitcher plays well. You get big hits from P. Crow Armstrong, from Morel, from Swanson, from a lot of guys who've been struggling. It's kind of like a everybody's happy type of game. No, and you in the 7th inning, you just break it open, 6-run lead. You never have to worry about coughing it up. Really, you have it basically in control. I like that. I would implore the Cubs to do more of that. I don't know if it's good TV or not, but it's good for my blood pressure.
Yeah, what's not good for my blood pressure is what happened the next day, and that is the Cubs losing 17-0. This game got out of hand real fast. Luke Little imploding and just having a rough go, and Boston having a time, and nothing you could do about it. And you end up with position players pitching, which it's a bad day. And yeah, just a real tough game. But those happen. They do. A game will get away from you here and there throughout the year. But this was just extra out of hand. It felt like this one just was way worse than usual.
We've talked about this before too, right? My biggest pet peeve is position players pitching.
Yep.
Matt Mervis sucks as a pitcher, and should not be on the mound, right? So yeah, the final was 17-0, but 6 of those runs were scored, right? I think it was about 6 runs were scored in bizarre fashion at the end. And I just don't like that I understand why people do it, but to me, you're just as likely to injure a position player. That's probably why they use Mervis, frankly, than you are anything else by not throwing, Almonte or somebody else out there, anybody else out there, Smyly, if he's not available, but whatever, just somebody, right? Throw a body out there. I don't like what it does to the game. I don't like what it does to the stats. And it just, as a paying customer, I would have been irritated by that. So yeah, blah, the whole game, blah, yuck.
Yuck.
Is that, I know it's a hyper technical term, but it was just awful. And as bad as it started off, Brown just, Brown didn't pitch as badly as perhaps the numbers look, I don't think. He did get hit a bit, but you're right. Little imploded. Brewer, who I don't know how long we'll see him for, gave up runs, and then the Cubs themselves just seemed to be completely out of gas. They didn't put much of a fight offensively. Well, none really. And so there you go. Yuck.
And unfortunately, things where Jordan Wicks gets scratched from the start because of the forearm tightness, and they have to kind of make decisions on who they're going to call up. And once again, Ben Brown gets thrown into a situation where, he didn't realize he was going to start, and then Hayden Wesneski gets thrown into the start on Sunday for the Cubs. And just again, it's that injury thing that piles up. And to your point, Pat, I think that it was, as Mervis took the mound, I was immediately like, you do realize this team is completely snake bitten by injuries, right? Did they unearth a mummy while they were building the DraftKings sportsbook at Wrigley Field? I was waiting for something to happen. I mean, heck, when this game was 11-0, Christopher Morel and Alex Canario nearly took each other's heads off in the outfield, which again, terrifying. Another heart-stopping moment, because you lose Morel's bat in the lineup. Going on at that point, it's can you even field a healthy team? So to see Mervis out there and then just getting shellacked and then having a ball hit right over his head, and then Wisdom got a ball hit back to him too. And so, of course, I'm not, going to say something silly but guys, I mean, think about it. They need to pad their stats. There's a lot of times where bonuses are at stake, etc. Not going to fault Boston for that at all, but there just has to be a better way to deal with this than to have Matt Mervis out there potentially getting himself hurt when you've seen so many other guys get back. I was with Pat on that one, where I hated seeing that.
So James, Jeremy, I have a question for you too, and you kind of alluded to it, James, so I wanted to just raise it. I don't know what the analytics suggest on this, but is there a greater disadvantage to having a young pitcher who's never faced a team be told he's starting hours before the game or shortly before a game, as opposed to a veteran pitcher who kind of knows the hitters? We always talk about, it goes both ways, right? The hitter familiarity and the pitcher familiarity, but just in terms of how to pitch guys and kind of looking at the book. And if you're going to be starting in a few days, you can look at the Red Sox, scouting reports, and you can spend more time. Obviously, that's what the catcher and the coaches are for, I suppose. But do you think that it is disadvantageous to have a pitcher in that spot who's younger, who isn't used to starting anyway, and is kind of thrown into it? Or do you think it actually is an advantage? I mean, as a Cubs fan, I know many times when a pitcher who's just been called up from AAA from another team has shut us out. But I mean, that's just a Cubs curse, I think.
That's a Cubs curse. Yeah. How many times does that happen when Pittsburgh calls up a guy you've never heard of,
right,
or St. Louis especially? And it feels like it happens to us all the time. And yeah,
but I don't think that's how it really works in real life. I haven't done the numbers, but who is more in need of more sort of research and practice and mental preparation, a guy who's never really started in the majors, or a veteran who can, let's say you have a healthy Drew Smyly who can just kind of roll out there. He's faced these guys, he knows who they are, etc. You tell me.
No, I think
I love the phrase "roll out there," by the way, because that's essentially what you do with Drew Smyly at times, and just kind of pray for the best.
Yeah, extra wrinkle added to that too is that Ben Brown grew up a Red Sox fan, had never been to Fenway until this weekend with the Cubs.
Do you think he threw the game?
That's
We're not going to start talking about throwing games because then I'll have to talk about Manchester City fan Chris Wood deciding that he didn't want to score on an empty net today against Nottingham Forest for absolutely nothing.
I don't know.
Sorry,
Pat. I don't know what those
sorry.
words mean, but it sounds terrible. Whatever it was.
Yeah, just a tough game. We'll throw that whole thing out. Forget about it.
Well, that's what you do, right? You just throw that one out and you move on.
Throw that one out.
It only counts as one loss.
Yes.
And I don't care about run differential in the way that I know some people are. Remember last year when people were hanging on for so long to the Cubs' run differential being so great after we blasted the A's and outscored them like 70-0 in 3 days. And then in May when we couldn't get a single hit or score a single run, people were like, well, our run differential is still plus 58 or plus 70. We're one of the best in the league until it just completely disappeared. Then they built it up again and then it went back down. I mean, I'm not as worried about that.
Hey, as we record this podcast, even with that loss, the Cubs run differential. So take that, Milwaukee.
So we will see how the Sunday game wraps up here as we podcast, but let's look ahead to the week that will be for the Cubs as they continue the road trip in New York against the Mets for 4 games. No off day as they roll then back home to take on the Brewers for 3 and then the Padres for 3 as well. So the 4 games against the Mets, we have probable starters here of Jameson Taillon against Luis Servino. Tuesday game, Javier Assad against Sean Monet. And then Wednesday, Shota Imanaga. And Thursday, Ben Brown. So that is how the 4 game starters for the Cubs will line up. We'll start with you, Pat, with those 4 against the Mets, and then you've got the 3 against Milwaukee. We'll start with the Mets series, Pat. How do you think the Cubs are going to fare here on this road trip?
When I saw Severino in New York, I just assumed it was the Yankees, but in fact, it is the Mets. You're right. It's hard to say. The Cubs have 3 pitchers, and then Ben Brown, and then it's going to be really questionable in the Brewer. I think the Brewers series, you look at their pitchers, not so hot either. So I mean, it could. There's a lot, and with all these young guys in the lineup, who knows how anybody's going to do? Really, it's harder and harder to predict. But I think of those 7 games, I think if the Cubs can go 3-4, that's sort of treading water, depending on how good you think the Yankees are right now. I guess let's look at this. For all the lefties the Cubs claim to have, it'd be nice if they would use some in this series. But I'd say probably 3-4. But if they go 4-3, that seems quite plausible too.
James, with these the Mets series, kind of a toss-up for me here. This is your best pitching matchups.
Mets. Why do I keep calling them the Yankees? I'm sorry, Mets.
You're trying to will it into existence.
I know.
You got on the Severino trip, you wouldn't let it go.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And they just played Boston, so you've got you've got the Yankees make sense. But against the Mets, this is your best pitching matchups. But you've got the Brewers team, who, like Pat mentioned, not scary anymore when it comes to the Brewers pitchers. They were always the team where the pitchers, you looked at the pitchers you were facing, you were like, oh man, like even Freddie Peralta's gonna take us out. And then you had the lineup where you couldn't even, you looked at that lineup up and down, you're like, no, when Christian Yelich was down, that whole lineup just seemed like not terrifying at all. It's completely flipped around, and now they've got a lot of fun young hitters. They've got a pretty darn good offense. and it's their pitching that's going to be just as suspect as the Cubs pitching coming in here. So your thoughts on the upcoming series?
Yeah, I think having Imanaga only pitch once in the 2 series will be rough in terms of trying to get out of it. Like Pat said, with maybe like a 4-3 record or a 3-4 record, I think that having that, I don't want to call him like kind of your stopper if things kind of start to spiral a little bit against them. But I also point out that the Mets went on a really nice run earlier in the season, won 8 out of 9 games. They've been in a bit of a tailspin recently. They have not been playing their best baseball. They did win against St. Louis on Sunday to salvage that series, but they really have been kind of playing not great baseball, and they're right around 500. I think that that's a team they can get hot and potentially, make some noise in the wild card race, but I would stack the Cubs up against them even with the injury concerns that they have. And so I think that a series split there, very real, is like you guys said, which Milwaukee team are we getting? Are we getting that team that can just, hit the baseball all over the ballpark? This is a team that recently swept St. Louis in St. Louis, had a couple of really nice wins against Pittsburgh. Or are we going to have the team that gave up Yankees? Like, it's kind of one of those weird things. They're a very hard team to kind of get a beat on right now. And I look at the way the Cubs are kind of setting this thing up, and they're definitely going to need to, bring the bats against the Brewers and take advantage of that pitching staff, because I get the sense that it's on wind, of course, you always have to kind of throw that caveat in there, but the temperatures are getting warmer. The Cubs are going to have to be hitting the baseball well. They've been able to do that at Wrigley Field this season, and I have high hopes that they can continue doing it against Milwaukee. The question for me is just whether they'll be able to outslug team, some really good offense this season.
The good news is it looks like the Cubs will miss Freddie Peralta, which is great, right?
Thank goodness.
Nice to catch a break. They're even going to miss Colin Ray, I think. So God only knows who they're going to end up getting. I don't even think the Brewers.
They're also missing Jose Quintana in the Mets series. Oh, darn.
Yes. Yeah. And they're missing Woodruff and Burns finally.
Finally.
I'm all out. However, they are going to catch one Brewer starting pitcher, Adrian Hauser, who's now with the Mets, unfortunately, who I can just see pitching 7 innings of 1-run baseball against us, given the sort of our luck. But yeah, overall, this is one of those series, the Mets, and then also with the Brewers, where it would be really incumbent upon the Cubs bats to kind of get out there and jump ahead, so we don't have to rely on the bullpen so much. As tonight in the 7th game of the week, sadly, Mark Leiter, who had been perfect all season, of course, comes in a tie game when it really matters and doesn't retire a single batter, and the Cubs lost to go 4-2.
I don't know. I'm watching that right now. I'm watching the final, the walk-off here on Sunday night. And where was Ian Happ on this play? I'm watching Dansby Swanson run all the way into left field trying to make this play.
There was nobody out
in the Green Monster.
They were just whatever.
Yeah. Anyway,
so I guess the 6th game of the week feels like 7. Doesn't it feel like the Cubs lost a lot more this week than they did? Just the way it ended, after such a good start. But 4-2 is 4-2, so I'm not complaining.
4-2 week, as predicted on this podcast last week. The Cubs, it comes to fruition here. So as we look ahead to lock in our let's see if we can keep the streak going here. We're going to lock in our predictions for the upcoming 7 games. Pat, we'll start with you.
I'm 3-4 still, I think. But if they finish 4-3, I think that would exceed expectations, would be very good.
James, where are you on this week's? Let's lock in these predictions for you.
I'm feeling a 4-3 week. Or actually, you know what? No, I'm sorry. I'm feeling a 3-3 week because I get the sense the Cubs are going to lose 1 game to rain. And it's going to be an annoying week where you're going to play really well against the Mets, win 2 out of 3, or even win 3 out of 4. And then Milwaukee's going to roll in and the Cubs are going to struggle at home. And it's just going to make no sense. And we're all going to be left scratching our heads, wondering what the heck happened. But if they play all 7 games, 3, but just that really bizarre win 3 of 4 in New York and then turn around and lose 2 out of 3 in Chicago to the Brewers.
I we'll make it unanimous, 3 and 4 week. Again, I think that is absolutely possible, and I think that is most likely. It's a tough week to predict because, like you mentioned, the injuries, the Mets, and then scratch your head with the Brewers as well. So who knows what this is going to look like, and I look forward to actually getting to start division play. The calendar turns to May. The Cubs are playing their first division games here. Next week we will recap we'll look back at the entire month of April, and it was a tough schedule with the injuries that they had as well. For them to come out where they are going into May, this is you couldn't ask for. I think it's exceeding expectations. If you told me Justin Steele wasn't going to play any games after he wasn't going to finish the first game, for them to have this record, I think you've got to be happy with the results so far.
All I'm going to say, boys, is that when you look at the month of May and you look at that schedule, at Pittsburgh, May 10th to 12th, then at Atlanta, home against Pittsburgh for 4, and against Atlanta for 3. That is a just murderer's row of a schedule. Justin Steele, for the love of God, we need you to come back by the time those 4 series roll around, because that's going to have the potential, if they can tread water through those 4 series, finish like around 500, such a massive shot in the arms of that team. But boy, they really have a chance at maybe kind of spiraling a little bit. Those are going to be some really tough games. I'm really kind of curious to see how they handle those 2 teams, specifically the Braves, just once again doing that thing where they're just head and shoulders of so other teams in this league.
An article came out today. ESPN, Jeff Passan, writes that MLB to modify uniforms after player complaints. Finally addressing, we've talked about it here many times on this podcast, how the uniforms, we've recounted the Fanatics and Nike uniform experience so far has been less than ideal, and the most prominent modification includes a return to larger lettering on the back of jerseys, remedying the mismatched gray tops and bottoms, and addressing the new Nike jerseys' propensity to collect sweat, according to the memos distributed to players.
So is this going to be like when Topps baseball cards comes out with these error cards, and then they have to replace them with like the fixed cards, and there's the jerseys they had for the 1 month that have the tiny little letters and everything will become collector's items? Is that what we're looking at here, or will they just all be thrown away?
The changes, which will happen at the latest by the beginning of the 2025 season.
Never mind.
Will also include fixes to the pants, widely panned this spring for being see-through. And we've seen the pants also explode on slides from players as well. So so Nike, Fanatics, and MLB are planning to address the uniform fiasco and have the fixes in place by, at the latest, the beginning of the 2025 baseball season.
Oh, operating so quickly to address what's been a known issue for several months, the glacial pace of change in Major League Baseball. Everything that they've done to this game for the last 2 years has been predicated on speeding things up, and then you have an actual problem crying out for a solution. I'll get around to that, in February or March of 2025. I don't know. Got to order the parts and the stitching. I don't know. Just a shit show. Sorry, I know we don't generally swear on this podcast.
No, that's the accurate representation of what's happening here. That's exactly correct. and as NHL fans like James and I are, we are wildly terrified for what next season is going to look like when they have to do the hockey sweaters.
I can't wait for the first guy to try to pull a jersey over his head and it just to rip down the middle. Fun.
By the way, I just noted something. James got me thinking about the future and schedule. Do you know that after this Mets series, the Cubs play 24 out of 35 games against the NL Central? And of the games they don't play against the NL Central, 6 are against the Braves and 3 are against the Padres. the two White Sox. So it's a lot will be determined about this season before the Fanatics jerseys come out, I think.
Yeah.
That's a game stretch that will tell the tale. And I don't mean the tale of the shirt of the jersey.
I applaud you, sir.
This will be the month of May will be very telling here for the Cubs. They can dig themselves quite a hole here. So we need to see players get healthy. We need to see players that are getting the opportunity step up and make the most of it. Otherwise, it can get out of hand real fast because you're looking at 7 games against the Brewers this month. That's huge. You won't have another opportunity to make those up later in the year. It's not with this schedule. You just don't have as many opportunities.
At least you'll also have the chance of getting Justin Steele back. There's a possibility you could get. I mean, Cody Bellinger is already taking dry swings and playing catch. He's hoping he's not going to be out for that long with the injury, which, you hear 2 broken ribs. You're like, how long is that going to last? But apparently he's kind of trying to fight through it a little bit. And then you also have the possibility of getting Seiya Suzuki back during the month of May as well, depending on how quickly that oblique injury heals. So maybe the Cubs do start to get right and to get healthy as we get into May, and they can get some contributions from those guys. But boy, that's a hard road to hoe when you've got all of those players out, especially a lot of guys who take up key roles on this bullpen or on this roster and then the starting.
Plus, if you get Drew Smyly back healthy, anything can happen.
Also accurate. Very accurate. Pat, can you take us to 1984 and let us know?
In my way back time machine.
Yeah, let me remind our listeners what we do here on this podcast. Every single week, we celebrate the 40th anniversary of the 1984 Cubs playoff team by going back into this week in 1984 and seeing how those 1984 Cubs were doing as we juxtapose it with the current 2024 Cubs. And Pat, take us back to 1984.
Sure. And Jeremy, let me preface it by saying listeners of the show often ask me, that you refer to me as your cousin, and they're like, is he really your cousin, or is this cousin like on the TV on the Bear, right? Is it kind of cousin in the vernacular, or is it cousin? And I'm like, no, it's cousin. So
very much so.
My dad, coincidentally, your uncle, not coincidentally actually, but by law, found something when he was digging through the garage or something at my parents' house and gave it to me on Friday. It is it's now been laminated, but it was a poster that I had on my wall in my bedroom as a kid. After the 1984 season, it was made by the paper company that our grandfather worked for. And that's where I acquired it from.
Pat is holding it up. If you're watching us on our YouTube channel, you can see what he's showing us.
It's actually pretty cool. It goes month by month. It goes game by game. It goes month by month with the standings. And then there are things in the corner that are significant, like Miracle in Wrigley Field, Cubs clinch, September 24th, 1984. Spoiler alert on that one. Yes. And it has the lineup, the playoff lineup all the way around, the manager, the roster, along with all of the championship seasons, sans for 2016, which had not occurred yet.
Very cool.
Top. So
that is a very cool poster.
And looking at this, it reminds me. So if we go back 40 years ago to this very week, what we saw was the Cubs winning. Let's see, it was 2 out of 3 from the St. Louis Cardinals, and then on the road, and then they won 2 out of 3 at Pittsburgh, including a 2-hitter by Scott Sanderson. Always like to see those. It doesn't list back then how many pitches were thrown, but I'm guessing it was probably like 88 or so from the looks of it. It wasn't a lot. Not a lot of walks, not a lot of strikeouts, not a lot of hits, obviously. Just kind of, old school, right? So the Cubs finished a 4-2 road trip. Steve Trout and Scott Sanderson, 2 of the starting pitchers in the rotation, were on fire. And looking at my calendar from that year through April 30th, and we'll flash forward to the end of the month, since by the time this airs, it'll be the end of the month. The Cubs had accumulated a tie for first place record. They're tied with the Mets, half a game ahead of the Phillies, with a record of 12-8, which was, by Cubs standards back in those days, that was really good. They were 12-8 to start the season. Juxtapose that to this year, where the Cubs will have played 30 games by the end of April. They had played but 20 back then, because the season was a little bit more backlit, and there were double headers and things like that. So the Cubs were off to a good start. They were 12-8. Ryan Sandberg, that second-year player who had moved over to second base, was en route to commit the same number of errors as Nico Hoerner has so far this year, but Sandberg did it in the entire season. Hoerner's on pace, by the way, with his fifth error today for 30-plus errors this year. That seems like a lot, which is a whole other point about the Cubs' middle infield defense this year. But we can save that for another
defensive podcast. Yes, that's another podcast.
But in 1984, Ryan Sandberg was doing quite well, and I was just sort of perusing through some of the stats. Catcher Jody Davis, Gary Matthews, the new left fielder they'd acquired from the Phillies at the end of March, all doing well. Leon Durham was getting a lot more appearances at first base, which was, for many of us who were fans of Bill Buckner, one of the greatest Cubs of all time, a bit unsettling, but Durham was doing well. All things where systems go with this patchwork four-man rotation, plenty of rainouts and a lot of hodgepodge in between. But Lee Smith, the closer, had now amassed 5 saves in his new role as permanent closer. And Cubs had a couple pitchers that were looking good. So they were 12-8, tied for first place with the Mets team, who, as we had talked about previously, the Mets had finished in last place the year before, and the Cubs had finished in second to last. So the division had been turned topsy-turvy, and the only question was, how long would this last? So that's where we were at the end of April 1984. And if you don't believe me, it's right here on the calendar. So, or whatever this is.
Very cool. Always fun, and looking forward to, as this roster continues to shake up, as they continue to build towards the playoffs, to diving deep into this.
The exciting part is yet to come.
It is, but it's very, it is fun to see, because we've talked about it before. When we started this podcast, we were doing the history of a lot of the Cubs seasons, and this team was bad for so long, that the 70s and then the early 80s until 84.
Like, after 1972, the Cubs didn't finish over 500 until 1984. Yes. So, Cubs fans went over a decade without a winning record. Just try to imagine that for a minute.
Yeah, so this is a big deal that they have a winning record here at the end of April. So
they reminded me a lot, actually, at this point of the year, of the 2015 Cubs, who seemed to be doing surprisingly okay, not great, but okay. And we were hopeful. We saw the signs of that team coming together, but we had no idea what was in store for us at the end of April of 2015.
James, were the 89 Cubs your team, or were 84?
Roughly,
you're too young for 84, right?
I think I was born in 1985, so I'm listening to you guys describe these things, and the only kind of way I can connect myself to that team is the fact that my dad has one of the old APBA baseball card games, which is kind of I don't want to call it an inferior version to Matic. I think it's honestly really fun, but he had that 1984 version of the game, and so intimately familiar with the Cubs roster and the limitations and the strengths of that team. And so hearing Pat take the trip down memory lane, I was able to kind of associate a lot of those, that late 80s, early 90s Cubs teams that I really kind of started to, obviously cognitively know the guys. Like, I remember Greg Maddux leaving and how pissed off my dad was about that. And that's like where the memories really kind of start to pile up. And then thankfully, Sammy Sosa and Mark Grace kind of helped to reverse the tailspin that happened very early in the life of a young James Neveau.
Well, James Neveau, before the advent of these fancy computerized baseball games, I played the entire Cubs season in 1984 through APBA. and several others, and I would keep a score on a scorecard on with pen and paper for each game.
Yep.
And then I would every week add up all the stats and accumulate them, and I have most of that saved somewhere. So I will have to go to my storage unit at some point and get some of my old handwritten childhood. My spelling was not great at the time, I will acknowledge, but I will get some of the sheets that I had from back then just to prove my
it's funny you mentioned that, because my dad literally that's do when he retires. Well, second thing. First thing is he's going to go on a trip in Europe. The second thing is he's going to play out all, 2,100 games or whatever of the MLB season from 1984. He's going to play out the entire season with APDA, and he wants to see replicate the results. And you know what? Godspeed, Dad. That sounds like a fun time to spend some time. And yeah, I get more power to him.
Any help, let him know I'm available.
Yeah, a guy who can help him out. Yeah,
absolutely.
You need somebody to play like 300 or 400 games for him, just to ease the burden.
Tag in so we can go out to Spain or something. That sounds like a good idea to me.
Oh, and I can't believe time flies. It's always a great time catching up with James, and please, James Neveau, remind our listeners where they can find all your work on the internet.
NBCChicago.com, NBCSportsChicago.com. I cover basically everything, but we all know the thing that I love doing the most is talking about and covering the Cubs for NBC Sports Chicago. You can also find my work on the Cubs Talk podcast and also on Big Ten Country. We had a really nice talk today about the NFL draft, how that all went over the weekend, and then got into transfer portal madness. Man, it is really hard keeping track of where everybody's going nowadays, but Ken Davis is the best.
We mentioned it. We have a YouTube channel, youtube.com. Go search for Wrigleyville Nation Podcast over there. Give us a subscribe, comment, likes. We use all of that to work the algorithm so other Cub fans can find the show. We're trying to build up the listener base over there. We need your help. Call to action. Go out there and give us a subscribe on the YouTube channel. And you can also tell your Cub fan friends about the show. Show them how to subscribe to a podcast. You continue to spread the word for us, and we want to thank all of our patrons again at Wrigleyville Nation, patreon.com/Wrigleyville Nation. There, our patrons have kept this show ad-free for yet another season, if you can believe it. So thank you to all the patrons. We could not do this show without you, and if you want to support the show, please go there and do so. You can find us on all the social media platforms at Wrigleyville Nat. That's Instagram, Threads, X, Twitter, Blue Sky. We're everywhere at Wrigleyville Nat. Facebook.com/Wrigleyville Nation as well. So please, all the links I described, the entire back catalog of this podcast, everything is available at the website, WrigleyvilleNation.com. And with that, we're going to call it a podcast. Pat, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Cousin Jeremy.
Thanks again, everyone, for listening, and we'll talk to you again next time.